All right, so continuing in the vein of federalism, American federalism, we're going to be talking about today in Lesson 7 the different types of federalism. Because throughout American history, as with most things, the type of federalism has evolved as we have developed and as we have gone through our nation's history. Different things have presented themselves on the national stage to really change the way that things are done in regards to federalism. So we will be talking about the different types. And so our learning objectives, our course learning objectives are to describe how federalism has evolved in the United States and to compare different conceptions of federalism, as well as our departmental learning outcome is to demonstrate knowledge of the federal system. And so by the end of the lesson, my hope is that you will be able to answer the questions: how has federalism in the United States evolved? And what are the different conceptions of federalism? Excuse me. All right, so there have been, since the beginning of time, beginning of our nation's government, this is going to be no surprise to any of you that have any sort of background in American history, but there have been significant struggles between the state and the federal powers as to who is able to exercise their political muscle in each realm. And there has been significant posturing by states and the federal government to determine their spheres of power. And so especially earlier on, as we are going to see them start utilizing their powers given to them in the Constitution, they're going to sort of be testing the waters to see what powers they actually have and to determine their spheres of power. And so in 1819, there's going to be this very important Supreme Court decision, and it's called McCulloch versus Maryland. And in this, there's going to be a fight between Maryland and the federal government. The federal government is going to charter the Second Bank of the United States, and Maryland is going to try to tax that entity. And so it works its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to create a vote and create a decision that establishes the federal government's ability to create that that federal bank, and says to Maryland that they do not have the ability to tax that federal bank. And so we're going to see a establishment of what is known as the doctrine of implied powers. And so if we think back to the enumerated powers that the Constitution gives the federal government, we know that there are specific things that the government can carry out. But in this Supreme Court decision, the Chief Justice John Marshall is going to build upon the necessary and proper clause, which, as you remember or should remember, establishes that states can federal government could exercise whatever power necessary and proper to carry out their functions. He's going to build upon the necessary and proper clause to grant Congress significant discretionary powers to achieve their constitutional responsibilities. And so, if you will excuse me, I apologize. I'm having some issues here. Anyway, it gives the federal government a wide berth in how they can go about putting their powers and their functions into place. And so they're going to get what is known as the implied powers. So they're not written in the Constitution, but because there are enumerated powers and there are things that are necessary to carry out those enumerated powers, the federal government has the ability to carry those out any way they see fit. And it is going to include a vast interpretation of federal power and these implied powers. There's another a Supreme Court decision known as Gibbons versus Ogden, which again, Chief Justice John Marshall, who's going to have play a significant role in defining federal power and sort of expanding federal power, he is going to reinforce the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution. Remember, regulating commerce is a power that is given strictly to the federal government, and this Supreme Court decision is going to be fought based upon navigation of rivers, and so he is going to expand the federal government's ability to regulate commerce to include regulating the navigation of rivers and seas and harbors there in the United States. And so in the time period between 1819 and 1860, we're going to see a significant shift towards national government powers. And there's going to be this ebb and flow between, periods of time where the federal government exercises more power, and then back to when the state governments exercise more power. But this time between 1819 and 1860 is going to be a very large time of federal government, national government power being sort of the dominant idea. Just checking my time, making sure my microphone continues to work. So, this moves us to the different types of federalism that have been practiced throughout American history. And the first type of federalism that is going to be practiced in the late 1870s is this idea of dual federalism, where state and national governments exercise exclusive authority in very distinct spheres of jurisdiction. There are no blended powers, really. Everything is very clearly defined. This is after the Civil War, and so there are going to be very specific powers that each branch, or each level of government is going to exercise. And so there is an example that one textbook uses that calls this sort of a layer cake approach, because when you look at the powers that are being exercised, there is no blended approach. It's not marbled. It's very defined as to which layer of government practices which specific sphere of jurisdiction. And so there are going to be two factors that lead to the development of this idea of dual federalism. And the first one is going to be the Supreme Court rulings blocking attempts by both state and federal governments to step outside of their boundaries. And so we're going to see the federal government play a role in becoming really the arbiter of the laws and the functions of government. In 1803, I probably should have mentioned this earlier. In 1803, there's going to be a Supreme Court case called Marbury versus Madison, and in this Supreme Court case, the powers of the federal government, the powers of the Supreme Court, really, are going to be expanded pretty exponentially. And the Supreme Court is going to essentially expand its powers to include the idea of judicial review, which is the capability of deciding which laws are constitutional and which laws are not constitutional. And so they really become that referee of government in 1803. And so we have some significant Supreme Court rulings that are going to really keep each level of government in their lane and not allow them to step outside their boundaries. And the prevailing economic philosophy of this time period did not like government interference. We're seeing a time period of industrial development, and if you know anything about the Industrial Revolution and industrial development, the industries and the manufacturing companies and things did not like government to step in, because the government is going to regulate things like working conditions and hours and pay and things like that, and is going to cut into these industrial profits. And so they really did not like the interference of the government. And so because of this prevailing economic theory, or this economic development that is going on, it's really going to play a role in guiding the Supreme Court to make decisions that keep each level of government in their lane. And so As we see industrialization, we're going to start to see a socioeconomic landscape change in the United States. We're going to see different socioeconomic groups start to develop out of industrialization. And because these industries do not like the government to regulate, we see no national regulatory supervision that ensures fair market prices. And so there is no government regulation that sort of steps in to help protect consumers. There's extreme collusive behavior amongst powerful industries that are going to emerge. And if you are in collusion with someone, you're working together to sort of have a more nefarious outcome. You're working together for the benefit of yourselves and not necessarily everybody in the market. And so Congress in 1887 will pass what's known as the Interstate Commerce Act, which creates the Interstate Commerce Commission to try to assist in helping to regulate some of these issues that are occurring because of industrialization. And then the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 prohibits monopolies and is going to severely restrain industry. And so that collusive behavior is going to start becoming a little bit more checked. But mostly, government intervention is going to work to promote market competition. And so it's really going to do very little to help any of the social issues that are emerging during this time period. And some of the social issues that are emerging during this time period include child labor, poor working conditions, terrible housing. We're going to see those tenement housing projects and things. But by and large, the governments are going to stay out of these issues. And so we're going to see dual federalism play a role all the way up until the 1930s. And then in the 1930s, we're going to start seeing a significant shift in the way that the states and the federal government sort of share their power and start operating. And so enter what is known as cooperative federalism. And cooperative federalism, as I said, is going to start in the 1930s because of the Great Depression. And it will last all the way up into the 20th century. And many of those New Deal ideas put forth by President, excuse me, I apologize, Franklin Roosevelt are going to be a part of this cooperative federalism. Because the nation is in the Great Depression, there is significant pressure on the national government to coordinate a very robust national response to economic hardships. So we're in this Great Depression. People are suffering, unemployment is significantly high, and who do we always turn to when there is a crisis? We turn to the government. And so even though for the past 60 or so years, the federal government has been sort of relegated to staying out of the economic sector of society, now people are looking towards the national government to help cure some of these economic hardships that are occurring. And so both levels of government are going to begin coordinating their actions to help solve national problems. And we know that one of the national problems during the 1930s is going to be predominantly the Great Depression. But we also have a significant civil rights struggle that is occurring in society as well. And so people are going to turn to the national government to try to remedy this issue in addition to the Great Depression. And so when we turn to government, we really expand their power, and it's going to erode the boundaries between state and national government. And so we're going to start to see less of a layered approach where things are very specific and each level of government operates within their own sphere, and we're going to start to see a more marbled effect where things are sort of intertwined. There's no real definitive boundary between one level of government's power and another. And so we're going to start to see more overlapping powers emerge between the state and national government. And so much of the key rulings under dual federalism are going to be undone and reversed. Among those, congressional ability to regulate manufacturing. predominantly the government had stayed out of regulating manufacturing. But now, with this high unemployment and things going on and people not being able to afford anything, Congress is going to step in and play a more active role. And Congress is also going to play a role in regulating the issues between labor and management. And so we're going to start to see some policies put into effect to sort of regulate how management is able to treat their workers and some of the rights that workers are going to get as a result, like the 8-hour working day and minimum wage, etc., better working conditions. And so even though it begins with the Great Depression, it begins in the 1930s with this New Deal, it is going to carry on all the way into the 1960s. And we're going to see President Johnson's administration expand the national government role in society by putting forth what is known as his Great Society program. And oftentimes when we talk about a President Johnson's administration, Lyndon Johnson's administration, we focus more on Vietnam and the foreign issues associated with his administration. And that is because there's this economic battle that really occurs between in a president's mind, and it's this idea between guns and butter, right? Essentially, do I spend money to provide protection and military might, or do I spend money to provide things at home in society? And so Johnson wanted his legacy to be this Great Society program, where he focuses on expanding healthcare, expanding education, expanding environmental protections, and creating better transportation systems, and protecting consumers, and helping with housing and civil rights and voting rights. But because of the escalating issue in Vietnam during this time period, most of this is going to be undone by that conflict in Vietnam, and most of it's going to be overshadowed. And so he will put forth a lot of these ideas, which will play a role in the state government and the federal government having to work together to implement some of these things, because President Johnson will mandate them, but then give certain grants to states to put these things into effect. And so it's going to require some work on the part of the federal government as well as the state governments. And so there is going to be cooperative federalism all the way up until President Johnson's administration. And it's going to leave two lasting attributes on federalism in the United States. The first is that it is going to create a nationalization of politics, and this is the result of the federal legislative activism aimed at addressing certain issues within society. And so politics is going to become very nationalized, and federal legislation is going to become very active. And so we're going to see them addressing marketplace inefficiencies, social and political inequalities, and poverty. And so cooperative federalism is going to try to level the playing field in each one of these areas. And it's going to leave a lasting impact on federalism in America. And it is, as they do this, anytime you give the government license to regulate something, regulate a marketplace, regulate social or political inequalities, or try to regulate poverty, you're increasing the size of the government. And so there's going to be significant federal grants that are going to occur that will be given to states and local authorities to try to carry out these ideas, try to remedy some of these inefficiencies within society. And so when you do that, you are increasing the size of the federal government, the power of the federal government. But these grants are going to be needed by states to keep pace with the changes that are occurring in the New Deal and the Great Society era programs, because there's significant changes within society, and they're happening very, very quickly, and they're very, very costly. And so as a result, we're going to see federal grants being poured into states so that they can keep up with these programs. The second lasting attribute of federalism is the flexibility that state and local authorities are given in implementing federal social welfare programs. So states and local governments are going to get more autonomy, get more flexibility in the way that they implement these programs. But because they get autonomy and because there's going to be 50 different ways in 50 different states of implementing federal programs, we're going to see significant cross-state differences and levels of coverage. So some states are going to implement federal policies in a certain way that might benefit the people more, and then you cross into another state, you move into another state, and they're going to be implemented in a different way that might provide lower coverage or might be in a way that doesn't benefit the people as much. And so there's going to be some inconsistencies as to how these programs are put into place in the states. And so this brings us up to the idea of new federalism. And we're going to see a couple of presidents. I just want to make sure I'm still on track. Okay, there we go. We're going to see new federalism be ushered in by President Nixon, and Reagan. President Ronald Reagan is going to be a significant utilizer of this idea of new federalism. But these two presidents are going to try to reverse some of this cooperative federalism, some of this expansion of federal power under cooperative federalism. Because politics have become extremely nationalized and concentrated at the national level, they're going to try to restore the state prominence in policy areas. They're going to try to devolve some of that centralized power from the state level, from the national levels back to the states. And so it's this new federalism is this idea that decentralization of policies really enhance administrative inefficiencies. And so we're going to see a reduction in overall public spending. We're going to see improved policy outcomes as we see the federal government handing power back over to state governments. And so with Richard Nixon, he is going to create and utilize the general revenue sharing programs that distribute funds to state and local governments with minimal restrictions on how the money is spent. And this is really kind of a dream for state and local governments, because oftentimes when money is shared with state and local governments from the federal level, there's going to be a lot of strings attached and you have to utilize it in a certain way. But Nixon is going to free up states to utilize the federal money in the ways that they see fit at the state level. And so this general sharing, revenue sharing, is going to be something that really hands a lot of power back to state level and local level instead of centralizing it at the national level. Reagan is going to usher in what is known as the devolution revolution. And devolution is simply the devolving of power from the federal government to more localized government. He is going to pledge the return of authority to the states according to the Constitution. And so, as we faced a lot of issues in the 1930s, we're going to see a lot of power be consolidated into the national government under cooperative federalism, and Reagan is going to really work to devolve that power back to the state level and decentralize it from the federal government. And in 1981, there's going to be what is known as the Omnibus or Budget Reconciliation Act. And what this does is it consolidates federal grants related to social welfare, and it's going to give states and local administrators significant greater discretion in federal funds, how federal funds are utilized in regards to social welfare. And so he's really going to return a lot of the power of spending back to the states. So there are going to be federal programs that need to be need to be administered in the states, but he's going to give the states much more power in how they do that and how they spend their federal funds. Since 9/11, between the Reagan administration and 9/11, there's actually been a significant swing back towards national power, because in times of crisis, in 9/11, we're going to look to that government to protect us and to create policies that make us feel more safe. Anytime there is a natural disaster, not even a natural disaster, but anytime there is some kind of a crisis in America, we're going to turn to the government for protection. And it's going to be in these times of crisis that we're going to see the federal powers really expand. And so since 9/11, there actually has been an expansion of national power. We have had the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which is going to federalize disaster responses. It's going to take that out of that federal money out of the state hands and federalize disaster response, whether that be a good thing or a bad thing, who really knows, because we all remember Hurricane Katrina and the terrible response that the federal government engaged in. But whatever the case, Homeland Security is going to be in charge of federal disasters, and so it's no longer, states obviously can do things at the state level, but it's no longer going to be that the federal government gives funds to state governments to deal with or to deal with any kind of disaster. It's the federal government that's going to deal with these issues. Since 9/11, we've had the creation of the TSA, the Transportation Safety Administration, which federalized airport security. No longer is this going to be in the hands of different states where the airports are. The federal government is going to step in and is going to be responsible for transportation safety, safety in the skies. No Child Left Behind, which is going to be enacted as a cooperative effort between George W. Bush and some very powerful senators like Edward Kennedy from Massachusetts. It's going to federalize education, and education is typically in the realm of state governments, and state governments are the ones that are supposed to essentially fund education and provide education for the people within their states. But it has been federalized since 9/11, since George W. Bush took office in 2000, and so there are going to be some very specific federal regulations that have to be followed at the state level. So it's going to essentially remove some of the power of a state to operate as they see fit in regards to education, and it's going to create a system where they must do certain things federally in order to get federal funding and federal programs. The Affordable Care Act that was passed under President Obama's administration, often known as Obamacare, is going to federalize health care. Again, health care is one of those things that has predominantly been in the realm of state power. But as we have progressed in our nation's history, it is one of those things that has become federalized, and whether that be good or bad, that is up to you. But the Affordable Care Act has really taken away some of the power of states to provide health care programs to their constituents, and has created federal programs that require states to do certain things in regards to providing health care for the citizens. And so this is new federalism. It is going to be a devolution of power up until 9/11, and then we're going to start to see the pendulum swing back towards federal power. Now, all of federalism is really going to hinge upon the types of federal money, and federal money that is going to be given to state and local governments. And by and large, when federal money is given to state governments, it is going to be a carrot and stick approach. And so sometimes there's going to be an incentive, and sometimes there's going to be a punishment. And so it just depends on what the program is, what the situation is. But states and local governments must be on board to achieve national objectives. The national government can put into place any objective that they really want to, but it's up to the states and the local governments to really carry those out at the more localized level. And if you don't have buy-in from states and local governments, it's going to be much more complicated to achieve these national objectives in all 50 states. And so intergovernmental grants are going to offer financial inducement to get states to work towards a set of national goals. So as a method of getting states to get on board with national objectives, there are going to be grants offered to states to sort of entice them, right? Because money is an enticer, and the national government has the power of the purse strings. And so we're going to see a carrot approach used to entice recipients or states to do something, institute something, institute these national objectives, these national goals. But we oftentimes see what are known as mandates. And if you have a mandate, these are typically going to be things that are unfunded or imposed by the federal government that are requirements on state and local governments, but there aren't going to be any carrots involved in instituting these types of things. And so when you have this, we're going to see more of a stick approach, because they're going to use a threat of punishment in some way to get states to get on board. If they're non-compliant, then they're going to get states to get on board. Kind of like that thing with that we talked about in the last lecture, Louisiana not really wanting to raise the drinking age to 21. And so even though it was a mandate from the federal government, and it didn't really provide any kind of funds to deal with any of the costs that might be associated with that, the federal government said, fine, if you don't, then we're going to withhold your highway funds, which didn't really have anything to do with the drinking age, but it provided the stick approach to get states to fall in line with national objectives. And so you have some things that are called unfunded mandates, which are federal laws and regulations that impose obligations on states and local government without fully compensating them for the administrative costs they incur. And so this really hacks off anybody. Anytime that there is something mandated from above that has to be put into effect, but there is no money that comes with it to institute it, and it's going to cost the state and local governments money to institute it, this is an unfunded mandate. And it's very, very, makes state and local governments extremely angry. And it is very contradictory of New Federalism's call for giving states and local governments more flexibility. If you have these mandates, these unfunded mandates especially, it takes any flexibility out of the equation, and it really goes against this idea of New Federalism. So there's a number of different types of grants that are going to be given from the federal government to the state governments and local governments to carry out some national objectives. And one of the first types of grants that are going to be utilized are going to be land grants. And it's going to be the primary way that the federal government supported states in the 1800s, first half of the 19th century. And these land grants are going to be utilized to fund or utilized to construct roads, railroads, bridges, and canals, and it's going to help to piece together a national transportation system. Land grants are going to be utilized to create universities on land that's donated by the federal government, such as the University of Maine, Ohio State University. Those are going to be recipients of federal land grants. And so they didn't have a whole lot of cash, perhaps, to give people in the 1800s or give states in the 1800s to the 1850s, but they had land. And so they're going to provide land as a mechanism to entice states to do certain national objectives. And then we turn our attention to cash grants that are going to replace land grants and have become a central part of modern federalism. And so this is how we entice people to, or entice states to get on board with certain things. We're going to give them money for certain things, or withhold money until they do certain things. But as I've stated, it does come with certain strings attached. And some of the strings are that they could be categorical grants, which are federal monies formulated to limit state discretion in the use of funds and subject them to strict administrative criteria. So they're categorical grants. You can only spend them in a certain way, and they often require very strict adherence to certain criteria. Oftentimes, categorical grants are going to be things like Medicaid, food stamps, the SNAP program, money from the federal government to fund these specific administrative programs, and so there's no flexibility there. Block grants, these have less strenuous conditions, and they work to provide states with more flexibility over how to spend funds. And so federal government oftentimes provide block grants for certain things that the state needs to institute according to the national objectives. There have been block grants provided for Workforce Investment Act, which helps youth and adults obtain skills to get better paying jobs. The Surface Transportation Act, which helps state and local governments maintain and improve highways, bridges, tunnels, sidewalks, and bike paths. And so these are going to be used to provide a function within society for the betterment of society within the states. And then there are these general revenue sharing grants that are the least stringent. And these were in operation during the Nixon through the Reagan administration, which was about 1972 to 1986. They're going to be began by Richard Nixon. They're going to provide very few restrictions on how the money can be used, but Reagan will end these in 1986. And so there is going to be significant amounts of money that will be involved in federalism and in how government objectives are carried out at the state and local level. So, just a review of your learning objectives and your essential questions. And so if you have any questions on federalism, this is something that you really need to understand as we move forward. It's going to be something that really plays out in all of government, the relationship between the state government and the federal government, and who has the power to act in certain realms of spheres of influence. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me via one of those communication tools in your syllabus.